Hey, good morning, scholars. I hope you guys had a great weekend. This is your last Monday class of the regular school year, although I know a good percentage of you guys are going to attend summer school, which I think is a great decision, especially now. Today, we're going to finish the book together. You will have a classic under your belt saying, you can go into eighth grade saying that you've read a Jack London book, which is more than I could say when I was my whole life. This is the first time I read this book, and I'm glad I could read it with you. So we're going to finish the book together today. Tomorrow, you're going to have a reflection prompt where you really reflect on the year that was as you close out your seventh grade year, and then kind of looking forward to eighth grade and beyond. What do you hope to that looks like for you? What do you hope to achieve, and how are you going to do it? So let's take a look at today's grit list. Welcome, Ba, Caleb, and Joaquin. I was also happy to unhighlight Lizbeth's name and I think Julian's name because they're no longer newcomers to the grit list. They just live here. I took it down from 3 columns to 2, but I got some really quality work and some really thoughtful writing. So let's take a look at some. Jeshua gave us our answer for number 1. So I'm going to share Jeshua's answers, and I'm going to give you some live coaching so that you can see how to more smoothly embed your evidence. What is Buck's strategy to take down the moose? Jeshua said, Buck is thinking of getting the moose away from the herd so none of the other moose can help fight back. Quote, Buck proceeds to cut the bull out from the herd. He does this by barking at the moose so it can go in a different direction. Quote, he would bark and dance in front of the bull. Really well selected quotes because not only do they show what Jeshua wants them to show, but they're nice and short. They can be more smoothly worked into Jeshua's own words. Let me show you how I would do that with these quotes right here. For each of these, Jeshua says what he wants to say, and then he gives the quote. We want the quote to finish what you want it to say. And here's how you could do that with this first one. It said, Buck is thinking of getting the moose away from its herd so none of the other moose can fight back. Then here's the quote, Buck proceeded to cut the bull out from the herd. If we delete some of the text, some of the words from this quote, we can just add it to your thinking, Jeshua. So right here, it says, he's getting the moose away from the herd so none of the other moose can fight back by boom, 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 boom. But this doesn't make sense, by cut the bull from the herd. So whenever your quote almost makes sense, but you need to add a word or you need to change something that's inside of the quote, what you do is you put your change in parentheses so that the reader knows that this was added so it would make more sense. You'll see this in newspapers whenever they're quoting somebody, but they need to just barely tweak one word. They'll put it in parentheses so that they know, like, hey, look, I'm not changing the person's. I made this change. This isn't what the person said, but now it makes more sense. Now it fits. So let's take a look at the change that we just made. So now it says Buck is thinking of getting the moose away from its herd, so none of the other moose can help fight back by cutting the bull from the herd. See how that flows more? It didn't say here's what happened. Now check out the quote that proves it. It blended them. That's how we embed evidence. So well selected, Jeshua, but fit the words into your own. We can do the same thing in the second one. He does this by barking. He does this by barking at the moose so it can go in a different direction. Check this out. He does this by quote barking, or I can say this. He would bark and dance out in front of the bull. Yeah, see this? So now it says he would, quote, bark and dance out in front of the bull. And now we go back in Jessu's words, so it can go in a different direction. So that's an example of just some smoother embedding of your evidence. All right, Jessu, I hope that was helpful. All scholars, I hope that was helpful. So what I did was, rather than say, here's what happened, here's a quote that proves it, I deleted some words and found out where can I fit this quote into my own words and what changes do I need to make so that they're in the same tense and it flows. If you have to change the tense inside the quote, put your change in parentheses. All right, let's keep going. Mon answered our question for why did the other moose abandon the large moose on whom Buck is focusing? The other moose abandoned the large moose on whom Buck is focusing on because Buck is trying to attack the bull. Buck's trying to attack the bull went on all day because Buck's attack on the bull went on all day. They were getting annoyed and, quote, seemed they could never shake off this tireless creature, which was Buck. They also realized that, quote, it was not the life of the herd or the young bulls that was threatened. So they saw no danger. They left the bull alone. I would use a little bit more strong language there. They didn't just leave the bull alone. So, so the other moose abandoned the bull. Why? You just add a little bit more. So they would no longer be threatened by Buck, right? They realized, man, if we just leave this one guy, this dog's that he's the only one that Buck wants. Let's just leave him. So they do. Cool. All right. You had 4 different themes you could have possibly used. The most common one that was picked on what theme is London showing by Buck's killing of the bull. The most common theme picked was that patience pays off. So Molly said, London demonstrates that patience pays off. He uses Buck's killing of the bull to depict that patience will reward you in the future or present. London uses this scene because of the patience Buck had to get something bigger than himself. London states, there is a patience of the wild, dogged, tireless, persistent as life itself, that holds motionless for an endless hours the spider in its web, the snake in its coils, the panther in its ambuscade. Its patience belongs particularly to life when it hunts its living food, and it belonged to Buck. And then she cut the quote off there because that was what she wanted, which is why she has ... and ellipses. London even uses the word patience to describe how long Buck is willing to wait for his food. Since the outcome was that Buck was able to kill the bull, it shows that his patience paid off. So he could have used this scene to describe that being patient will pay off, and no matter how hard or difficult it is, it'll pay off. In conclusion, London uses the scene of Buck killing the bull to show and let the readers know that patience pays off. Uriel picked that nature is merciless, and he does so in 2 ways, which I think is effective. He proves that he's talking about Buck being merciless, and he proves it in 2 ways. He does it by describing how Buck is now killing for his food, and he also gets particular about how Buck just kept harassing the moose, nonstop. He didn't care how they felt. So good job, Uriel, using 2 different ways to prove your point that nature is merciless. And then the other, Catherine was one of the only students who picked the theme of oh, my bad. I just did Uriel's twice on accident. Let's go into Catherine's. Catherine was one of the only students that picked that people or your loved ones will abandon you when you're no longer useful, which is kind of a depressing theme if you pick that one, but it's what happened to the moose. Also, guys, I didn't give any clear feedback on Friday, and I forgot to delete the old questions from the day before, so I apologize for the confusion that caused some of you, particularly Molly. All right. Catherine says London demonstrates the theme that loved ones will abandon you if you become a liability by depicting Buck's killing of the bull. In Call of the Wild by Jack London, Buck goes into the forest, finds a herd of moose, and spots an injured moose. Buck targets the moose, isolates the moose from its herd, and kills the moose 4 days later. But when he was thus separated from his fellows, 2 or 3 of the younger bulls would charge back upon Buck and enable the wounded bull to rejoin the herd. This shows that at first the moose were protecting each other. The herd knew Buck's strategy was to lure the moose out of his herd to kill him. So whenever he would see him out of the herd, whenever they would see him out of the herd, they would distract Buck, and the moose would enter the herd or re-enter the herd. Catherine, the moose felt that they were protecting a teammate, but didn't think of him as a liability. Buck targeted one moose only, knowing he could not kill all the moose, and decided to lure the targeted moose out of his herd. London is describing the actions of Buck and how the herd reacts to show the herd cared enough about the moose to protect him. Quote, besides, it was not the life of the herd or the young bulls that was threatened, the life of only one member was threatened. This shows that the moose decided to leave one member behind. It was the life of only one moose that was threatened, and only one moose was targeted. This moose was continued to be attacked, and the attacker was not leaving any time soon. The herd needed to travel, but the moose was slowing them down. It was either the life of one moose or the herd, so they left. So, Catherine, I like how you're kind of understanding in this. You understand that their logic is, um, you know, this could be bad for the whole herd if we don't leave this one moose. London shows us this by describing Buck's strategy to annoy the herd and isolate the moose. In conclusion, London demonstrates the theme that loved ones will abandon you if you become a liability. London achieves this by depicting the killing of the bull to show that at first the herd protected the bull, but once they saw him as a liability, they abandoned him and left him to die alone. Those pages made me great writing, Catherine. Way to really prove your point, especially with your context. The way that you describe what happened made it clear what you were showing us. That page made me sad. Those pages were like just kind of hard to read. All right, guys, let's finish. We're opening up our books to page 81. I'm going to read these pages with you. It's really important that you read along with me so your eyes are absorbing these words so that they can get to your brain, especially when I get to words that you maybe would have struggled with if you were reading this independently. If you're following along with me with your eyes as you get to those words and you hear my expression and how it's pronounced, then that word it's almost like your brain successfully read it itself. So you'll get better at reading. This is great reading practice, but only if you're following along with me as I read. Today's questions are a lot of just 2 and 3 point questions, just for you to like finish the book and track what's going on as we go. And then there's a multiple choice question at the end. All right, here we go. So where we last left off, Buck had just killed the moose. He felt something, some kind of change over the valley. He didn't quite know what it was though, and now he's turned his back to camp and he's heading back home. The first question reading for is, how does Buck demonstrate that he is alarmed as he approaches camp? As he held on, he became more and more conscious of the new stir in the land. There was life abroad in it, different from the life which had been there throughout the summer. No longer was this fact borne upon him in some subtle, mysterious way. The birds talked of it, the squirrels chattered about it, the very breeze whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew in the fresh morning air in great sniffs, reading a message which made him leap on with greater speed. He was oppressed with the sense of calamity happening, if it were not calamity already happened, and as he crossed the watershed and dropped down into the valley toward camp, he proceeded with greater caution. Again, you're looking for how does London demonstrate that Buck was alarmed. You already can use at least one piece of evidence from the last couple of sentences I read. 3 miles away, he came upon a fresh trail that sent his neck hair rippling and bristling. It led straight toward camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on, swiftly and stealthily, every nerve straining and tense, alert to the multitudinous details which told a story, all but the end. His nose gave him a varying description of the passage of the life on the heels of which he was traveling. He remarked the pregnant silence of the forest. The bird life had flitted. The squirrels were in hiding. One only he saw, a gray sleek fellow, flattened against a gray dead limb, so he seemed to be a part of it, a woody excrescence upon the wood itself. So there's all your evidence. Find at least two pieces of evidence to embed. How does London show that Buck is alarmed as he's approaching camp? Pause me, go back and pull your evidence, and go ahead and answer that question for number one. We're going to keep going to question two. What does Buck find happened at the camp, and how does he react? As Buck slid along with the obscureness of a gliding shadow, his nose was jerked suddenly to the side, as though a positive force had gripped and pulled it. He followed the new scent into a thicket and found Nig. He was lying on his side, dead where he had dragged himself, an arrow protruding, head and feathers, from either side of his body. 100 yards further on, Buck came upon one of the sled dogs Thornton had bought in Dawson. This dog was thrashing about in a death struggle directly on the trail. Buck passed around him without stopping. From the camp came the faint sounds of voices, rising and falling in a sing-song chant. Bellying toward the edge of the clearing, he found Hans, lying on his face, feathered with arrows like a porcupine. At the same instant, Buck peered out where the Spruce Bow Lodge had been and saw what made his hair leap straight up in his neck and shoulders. A gust of overpowering rage swept over him. He did not know that he growled, but he growled aloud with a terrible ferocity. For the last time in his life, he allowed passion to usurp cunning and reason, and it was because of his great love for John Thornton that he lost his head. So we know what happened. You can describe what happened at this camp. Yeehats are a Native American tribe from Alaska. So we know what happened at the camp. Now let's figure out what Buck's reaction to it is. The Yeehats were dancing about the wreckage of the Spruce Bow Lodge when they heard a fearful roaring and saw rushing upon them an animal the like of which they had never seen before. It was Buck, a live hurricane of fury, hurling himself upon them in a frenzy to destroy. He sprang upon the foremost man. It was the chief of the Yeehats, ripping his throat wide open till the rent jugular spouted a fountain of blood. He did not pause to worry the victim, but ripped in passing, with the next bound tearing wide the throat of a second man. There was no withstanding him. He plunged about in their very midst, tearing, rending, destroying, in constant and terrific motion which defied the arrows they discharged at him. In fact, so inconceivably rapid were his movements, and so closely were the Indians tangled together, that they shot one another with the arrows. And one young hunter, hurling a spear at Buck in midair, drove it through the chest of another hunter with such force that the point broke through the skin of the back and stood out beyond. Then a panic seized the Yeehats, and they fled in terror to the woods, proclaiming as they fled the advent of the evil spirit. And truly, Buck was the fiend incarnate, raging at their heels and dragging them down like deer as they raced through the woods. It was a fateful day for the Yeehats. They scattered far and wide over the country, and it was not till a week later that the last of the survivors gathered together in a low valley and counted their losses. As for Buck, wearying of the pursuit, he returned to the desolated camp. He found Pete, where he had been killed in his blankets in the first moment of surprise. Thornton's desperate struggle was fresh written on the earth, and Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of a deep pool. By the edge, head and fore in the water, lay Skeet, faithful to the last. The pool itself, muddied and discolored from the sluice boxes, effectually hid what it contained, and it contained John Thornton, for Buck followed his trace into the water from which no trace led away. All day, Buck brooded by the pool and roamed restlessly about the camp. Death, as a cessation of movement, as a passing out and away of the lives of the living, he knew, and he knew John Thornton was dead. It was a great void in him. It left a great void in him, something akin to hunger, but a void which ached, and which food could not fill. At times, when he paused to contemplate the carcasses of the Yeehats, he forgot the pain of it, and at such time he was aware of a great pride in himself, a pride greater than any he had yet experienced. I'm going to pause there. You guys should be able to answer question 2. What happened at the camp, and how did Buck react? Pause there to answer that question and bet at least 2 pieces of evidence. I'm going to go on to number 3 now. Pay attention to what I'm about to read. How is Buck changed after defeating the Yeehats? This one's kind of a 2-point question. I'm going to go back to at times. At times when he paused to contemplate the carcasses of the Yeehats, he forgot the pain of it, and at such times he was aware of a great pride in himself, a pride greater than any he had yet experienced. He had killed man, the noblest game of all, and he had killed in the face of the law of club and fang. He sniffed the bodies curiously. They had died so easily. It was harder to kill a husky dog than them. They were no match at all, were it not for their arrows and spears and clubs. Thenceforth, he would be unafraid of them, except when they bore in their hands their arrows, spears, and clubs. You should be able to answer that third question now. How was Buck changed? Night came on. Pause me if you didn't answer that one. I'm going to keep going. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees into the sky, lighting the land till they lay bathed in ghostly day. And with the coming of the night, brooding and mourning by the pool, Buck became alive to a stirring of the new life of the forest, other than that which the Yeehats had made. He stood up, listening and scenting. From far away drifted a faint, sharp yelp, followed by a chorus of similar sharp yelps. As the moments passed, the yelps grew closer and louder. Again, Buck knew them as things heard in that other world which persisted in his memory. He walked to the center of the open space and listened. It was the call, the many-noted call, sounding more luringly and compellingly than ever before. And as never before, he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broken. Man and the claims of man no longer bound him. Hunting their living meat as the Yeehats were hunting it, on the flanks of the migrating moose, the wolf pack had at last crossed over from the land of streams and timber and invaded Buck's Valley. Into the clearing where the moonlight streamed, they poured in like a silvery flood, and in the center of the clearing stood Buck, motionless as a statue, wanting their coming. They were awed, so still and large he stood, and a moment's pause fell. Pause here. I'm about to go over now. What I'm about to read is gonna answer question 4. How does Buck earn his way into the wolf pack? They were awed. So still and large he stood, and a moment's pause fell, till the boldest one leapt straight for him. Like a flash Buck struck, breaking the neck. Then he stood, without movement, as before, the stricken wolf rolling in agony behind him. Three others tried in sharp succession, and one after the other they drew back, streaming blood from slashed throats or shoulders. This was sufficient to fling the whole pack forward, pell-mell, crowded together, blocked and confused by its eagerness to pull down the prey. Buck's marvelous quickness and agility stood him in good stead. Pivoting on his hind legs and snapping and gashing, he was everywhere at once, presenting a front which was apparently unbroken, so swiftly did he whirl and guard from side to side. But to prevent them from getting behind him, he was forced back, down across the pool into the creek bed, till he brought up against a, till he brought up against a high gravel bank. He worked along to a right angle in the bank which the men had made from the course of mining, and in this angle he came to bay, protected on three sides, and with nothing to do but face the front. So he's backed himself into a corner in the rocks where he's protected from all sides. They can't surround him because he's got rocks surrounding most of him, and now he can just focus on the front. And so well did he face it that at the end of half an hour the wolves drew back, discomfited. Their tongues were all out and lolling, the white fangs showing cruelly white in the moonlight. Some were lying down with heads raised and ears pricked forward. Others stood on their feet, watching him. And still others were lapping water from the pool. One wolf, long and lean and gray, advanced cautiously in a friendly way, and Buck recognized the wild brother with whom he had run for a day and a night. He was whining softly, and as Buck whined, they touched noses. Now we're getting into how Buck earned his way into the pack. So we already have the first half of what Buck just did as he was attacked. Now we're going to watch as he's accepted. Take both of the parts of his fights and his acceptance to answer the question of what did Buck do? How does Buck earn his way into the wolf pack? Then an old wolf, gaunt and battle-scarred, came forward. Buck writhed his lips in the preliminary of a snarl, but sniffed noses with him. Whereupon the old wolf sat down, pointed nose to the moon, and broke out in a long wolf howl. The others sat down and howled. And now the call came to Buck in unmistakable accents. He too sat down and howled. This over, he came out of his angle, and the pack crowded around, sniffing him in half-friendly, half-savage manner. The leaders lifted the yelp of the pack and sprang away into the woods. The wolves swung in behind, yelping in chorus, and Buck ran with them, side by side with the wild brother, yelping as he ran. So now we get to the end of the book. We see that Buck is now part of the wolf pack, and now we're going to see kind of the impact that Buck has had in, fast forward a few years. We're going to see the impact that Buck has had on the wolves themselves and also on the people in the Yeehats, because he's become kind of a legend. And here may well end the story of Buck. But years were not many when the Yeehats noted a change in the breed of timber wolves. For some were seen with splashes of brown on head and muzzle, and with a rift of white centering down the chest. So the wolves are starting to look like Buck because he's the father of a lot of these new wolves that are being born. But more remarkable than this, the Yeehats tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog, for it has cunning greater than they, stealing from their camps in fierce winters, robbing their traps, slaying their dogs, and defying their bravest hunters. Nay, the tale grows worse. Hunters there are who fail to return to the camp, and hunters there have been whom their tribesmen found with throats slashed cruelly open, and with wolf prints about them in the snow greater than the prints of any wolf. Each fall, when the Yeehats follow the movement of the moose, there is a certain valley which they never enter, and there are women there are who become sad when the word goes over the fire of how the evil spirit came to select that valley for an abiding place. In the summers, there is one visitor, however, to that valley of which the Yeehats do not know. It is a great, gloriously coated wolf like, and yet unlike, all other wolves. Right here's going to be the answer to the multiple choice. This is Buck that they're describing. The multiple choice question asks, um, which line best explains why Buck returns to that valley? He crosses alone from the smiling timberland and comes down into an open space among the trees. Here a yellow stream flows from rotted moose sack hides and sinks into the ground, and with long grasses growing through it, and vegetable mold overrunning it and hiding its yellow from the sun. And here he muses for a time, howling once, long and mournfully, ere he departs. So that's the camp. That's the camp where Thornton was killed. This is their rotted moose hide sacks, and it talks about the yellow. That's all the gold that they found that will just go, it just will sit there forever. It's going to go unfound. But he was not always alone. When the long winter nights come on, and the wolves follow their meat into the lower valleys, he may be seen, running at the head of the pack, through the pale moonlight or glimmering borealis, leaping gigantic above his fellows, his great throat a bellow as he sings a song of the younger world, which is a song of the pack. There we have it. We learned that Buck became the leader of the wolf pack. Go ahead and select which one of these quotes best shows why Buck returns to that valley each year. And you are done. We have read Call of the Wild. You should have been pausing and answering these questions as you went. And I'm excited to look at your responses tomorrow. Take your time to answer these, and I'll see you tomorrow for our last lit class of the year. All right, guys. See you then.